The autumn rain fell steadily on Boston's cobblestone streets as Marcus Whitmore pushed open the heavy oak door of the Hawthorne estate. Water dripped from his wool coat onto the marble foyer, creating small pools that reflected the gaslight flickering from brass sconces. He had been summoned here by Miss Eleanor Hawthorne herself, the eldest of the three sisters who had inherited this imposing federal-style mansion on Beacon Hill after their father's death 6 months prior. The air inside carried the musty scent of old wealth and secrets long buried. A servant, an elderly woman with weathered hands and eyes that held no warmth, took his coat without a word and gestured toward the drawing room. Marcus had built his reputation as Boston's most skilled art restorer over the past decade, working on pieces for the city's most prominent families. Yet something about this particular commission unsettled him from the moment he received the letter. The Hawthorne name carried weight in Boston society, but it also carried whispers. Rumors that people shared only in hushed tones after too much brandy at private clubs. Eleanor Hawthorne stood before the fireplace, her black mourning dress stark against the room's burgundy wallpaper. She was perhaps 30 years old, with sharp features that spoke of intelligence and determination. Her sisters, Margaret and Catherine, sat on a velvet settee near the window, both younger but bearing the same angular beauty. All three wore their grief like armor, their faces composed but their eyes betraying something more complex than simple sorrow. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming on such short notice," Eleanor said, her voice steady and cultured. "I trust the compensation we offered was adequate incentive for the inconvenience." Marcus nodded, removing his gloves. "Your letter mentioned a family portrait in need of restoration. I confess I'm intrigued by your description of its condition." Eleanor exchanged glances with her sisters before crossing to a sheet-covered object leaning against the far wall. With deliberate movements, she pulled away the cloth, revealing a large oil painting in a gilded frame. The canvas was darkened with age and grime, the images beneath barely visible through decades of accumulated smoke and dust. Marcus stepped closer, his trained eye already assessing the damage. "This portrait was commissioned by our grandfather in 1787, Eleanor explained, her fingers trailing along the frame's edge. "It depicted our grandmother and her 2 younger sisters. The painting hung in our grandfather's study until his death in 1812. Then it was moved to the attic. We only discovered it last month while sorting through our father's belongings." Marcus pulled his magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the surface. The painting had indeed suffered from neglect, but the canvas appeared structurally sound. Years of soot and yellowed varnish obscured the details, but he could make out the faint outlines of 3 women in late 18th century dress. "I can certainly restore this," he said, already mentally cataloguing the supplies he would need. "It will take several weeks, possibly 2 months, depending on what we find beneath these layers. I'll need to set up my workspace here in the house. The painting is too fragile to transport safely in its current state." "That's acceptable," Eleanor replied. "We've prepared the east parlor for your use. You'll have complete privacy and access to whatever you require." She paused, her expression hardening slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, I must ask for your absolute discretion regarding this commission and anything you might observe while working here." Something in her tone made Marcus's skin prickle with unease. "Of course, Miss Hawthorne. All my clients receive complete confidentiality." "I mean it quite literally," Eleanor continued, moving closer until he could see the intensity in her grey eyes. "My father was a man of particular habits and interests. This house holds many, remnants of his pursuits. Some might find them disturbing without proper context." Marcus thought of the rumors he'd heard about Jonathan Hawthorne. The man had been a shipping merchant who'd made his fortune in the West Indies trade before such enterprises became complicated by changing laws and shifting moral sentiments. There were whispers about the true nature of his business dealings, about ships that carried cargo that wasn't listed in any official manifest, about a man who believed that freedom was a commodity to be traded like sugar or cotton. "I understand," Marcus said, though he wasn't certain he did. "When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow," Eleanor answered. "And Mr. Whitmore, one more thing. If you discover anything unusual in the painting during your restoration, anything at all that seems out of place, you are to inform me immediately before proceeding further. Is that clear?" Marcus agreed, though the request struck him as odd. What could possibly be hidden in a century-old family portrait that would warrant such concern? He gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, but as he reached the door, Catherine, the youngest sister, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Whitmore," she called out, her voice soft but urgent. "Do you believe that some truths are better left buried?" He turned to face her. Catherine's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white against the black fabric of her dress. Margaret placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm, but Catherine shook it off. "Catherine, enough!" Eleanor said sharply. "He should know," Catherine insisted, rising to her feet. "He should know what he's getting himself into before he agrees to this." "Know what?" Marcus asked, his curiosity now fully aroused, despite the warning bells in his mind. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "My sister is overwrought. Our father's death has been difficult for all of us, but Catherine has taken it particularly hard. Please pay her no mind." But Marcus was looking at Catherine, at the fear in her eyes that seemed entirely at odds with her words. This wasn't grief he was seeing, it was terror, barely contained beneath the veneer of propriety. "There were 4 sisters," Catherine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In the original portrait, our grandfather commissioned it with 4 subjects, but when our father inherited the painting, he had it altered. Someone was removed from the canvas, painted over as if she never existed. And now you're going to strip away those layers and reveal what he tried so desperately to hide." "Catherine," Margaret finally spoke, her voice sharp with warning. "You're speaking nonsense. The fever has affected your judgment." But Marcus saw no fever in Catherine's eyes, only a terrible clarity. Before he could respond, Eleanor stepped between them, her expression cold and dismissive. "Mr. Whitmore, I apologize for my sister's outburst. She's unwell. Please return tomorrow morning at 9. My man will have everything prepared for you." Marcus found himself being ushered toward the door, the elderly servant already waiting with his coat. As he stepped back out into the rain, he heard Catherine's voice one more time, calling from the drawing room with desperate urgency. "Check the eyes, Mr. Whitmore. When you clean the portrait, look carefully at the eyes." The door closed firmly behind him, cutting off whatever else she might have said. Marcus stood on the steps of the Hawthorne mansion, rain soaking through his shirt as he stared up at the imposing structure. Gaslight flickered in the windows, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than chance. Somewhere in that house lay a portrait that someone had deliberately altered, erasing one of 4 sisters from family history, and tomorrow he would begin the process of bringing her back. The rain fell harder as Marcus made his way down Beacon Hill, but he barely noticed. His mind was already working through the technical challenges of the restoration, but more than that, he couldn't shake the image of Catherine's terrified face or the weight of her warning. Check the eyes. What could she possibly mean by that? In his years of restoration work, Marcus had seen many alterations to paintings, usually done to flatter the subject or correct perceived flaws. But to remove an entire person from a family portrait suggested something far more sinister than vanity. By the time Marcus reached his modest apartment near the common, his clothes were thoroughly soaked. He lit a fire and changed into dry garments, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. He pulled out his professional journals, reviewing his notes on similar restoration projects. The process would be straightforward enough, carefully removing the darkened varnish and accumulated grime layer by layer, then assessing any underlying damage or alterations to the original canvas. But this time felt different. This time he would be uncovering not just an old painting, but a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. And if Catherine's words held any truth, he was about to reveal the existence of a woman who had been deliberately erased from the Hawthorne family history. Sleep came reluctantly that night, and when it did, Marcus dreamed of eyes watching him from darkened canvases, of portraits where the subjects moved when he looked away, of secrets buried so deep they poisoned the very ground they lay beneath. Marcus arrived at the Hawthorne estate precisely at 9 the following morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean under a pale November sky. The same elderly servant admitted him, leading him through the main hall to the east parlour without a word. The room had been transformed into a makeshift studio. Large windows on 2 walls provided excellent natural light, and someone had cleared away most of the furniture, leaving only the essentials. The portrait stood on an easel in the centre, still covered by its cloth. His supplies had been delivered earlier and arranged on a long table. Solvents, brushes, cotton wool, various solutions he'd specified in his list. Everything was meticulously organized, suggesting that the Hawthornes employed servants who understood the value of precision. Marcus removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, preparing for the careful work ahead. "I trust everything is to your satisfaction." He turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, dressed today in a dark blue day dress, still mourning but with slightly less severity than yesterday's black. She moved into the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, her gaze sweeping across his setup with an assessing eye. "It's perfect," Marcus replied. "Your staff has been most helpful." "Good. I want you to understand that you have complete freedom to work as you see fit. No one will disturb you here. Meals will be brought to you at noon and 6. If you require anything at all, simply ring the bell." She gestured to a brass bell on the side table. "Miss Hawthorne," Marcus said carefully, "about what your sister said yesterday." "Catherine is prone to imaginative episodes," Eleanor interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Our father's death has taken a toll on her mental stability. I would ask that you disregard her ramblings entirely. You're here to restore a painting, nothing more. Whatever you may find beneath the grime and varnish is simply art, Mr. Whitmore. Canvas and paint. Nothing to concern yourself with beyond the technical challenges of your craft." But even as she spoke, Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the folds of her skirt. Whatever lay beneath those darkened layers, Eleanor Hawthorne was not as unconcerned as she pretended to be. After she left, Marcus stood alone with the covered portrait. He felt a strange reluctance to begin, a superstitious dread that belonged more to a child afraid of the dark than a professional craftsman. Shaking off the feeling, he removed the cloth and set to work. The first phase of restoration was always the most tedious, but also the most revealing. Marcus began by carefully testing small areas of the surface with different solvents, determining which would most effectively remove the yellowed varnish without damaging the paint beneath. He worked methodically, documenting each step in his notebook, noting the painting's dimensions, the condition of the canvas, the style of the frame. As he gently cleaned a small section in the upper right corner, colors began to emerge from beneath the grime, rich burgundies and deep blues, the quality of pigment suggesting a master's hand. The brushwork was confident and skilled, likely the work of one of the prominent portraitists working in Boston during the post-revolutionary period. Marcus felt the familiar thrill that came with revealing beauty long hidden from the world. Hours passed. The autumn light shifted across the room, and Marcus became lost in the meditative rhythm of his work. By midday, when a servant brought his lunch, he had cleaned roughly a quarter of the canvas. The portrait was beginning to take shape, and what emerged was striking in its craftsmanship. 3 women appeared through the clearing haze, or rather, what seemed to be 3 women. They were arranged in a classical composition, seated in an elegant parlour with rich furnishings visible in the background. The artist had captured them in the fashion of the 1780s, with elaborate hairstyles and silk gowns that spoke of considerable wealth. Their faces were beginning to emerge, rendered with remarkable attention to detail and psychological depth. But something was wrong. Marcus leaned closer, his trained eye catching an inconsistency that most people would never notice. The spacing of the figures seemed unnatural, asymmetrical in a way that no skilled portraitist would have chosen deliberately. There was too much empty space on the left side of the composition, disrupting the visual balance. And in that space, as he carefully cleaned away more of the yellowed varnish, he began to see something that made his heart beat faster. Pentimento, the ghostly traces of earlier paint layers showing through, revealing what had once been there and had been deliberately painted over. The faint outline of another figure, a 4th woman who had been removed from the composition sometime after the portrait's original creation. Marcus sat back, wiping his hands on a cloth. Catherine had been right. There had been 4 sisters in the original portrait. Someone, presumably Jonathan Hawthorne, had hired another artist to alter the painting, covering one of the women with matching background elements and adjusting the remaining figures to create the illusion of a composition that had always contained only 3 subjects. But why? What could drive a man to erase his own relative from a family portrait? The obvious answer involved scandal, perhaps an illegitimate child, or a woman who had brought shame to the family name. Yet the elaborate lengths taken to conceal her existence suggested something more than simple embarrassment. This spoke of fear, of a desperate need to make someone disappear completely from family memory. Marcus spent the afternoon working on other sections of the portrait, but his mind kept returning to that empty space, to the phantom presence of the removed sister. As the light began to fail and servants came to light the gas lamps, he found himself staring at the portion he'd cleaned, studying the faces of the 3 visible women. The eldest, who would have been the grandmother of Eleanor and her sisters, sat in the center. She had a stern, handsome face, her expression suggesting intelligence and perhaps a certain hardness. The middle sister, positioned to her right, was softer in appearance, with a gentle smile and kind eyes, but it was the youngest visible sister, barely more than a girl in the portrait, who captured Marcus's attention and sent a chill down his spine. Her eyes were wrong. At first he couldn't articulate exactly what disturbed him about them. The technical skill was flawless. The artist had rendered them with all the anatomical precision and luminosity one would expect from a master. But there was something in their expression, something in the way they seemed to look not at the viewer, but past them, toward something only she could see. There was no light in those eyes, no spark of life. They were dead eyes, painted onto a living face. Marcus continued cleaning, working his way across the canvas as the evening deepened. A servant brought his dinner, but he barely touched it, too absorbed in the painting to care about food. By the time the clock struck 9, he had cleaned roughly half the portrait, and the full horror of what he was uncovering had begun to reveal itself. The 4th figure was becoming more visible through the pentimento. She had been positioned to the left of the eldest sister, and though the overpainting obscured most details, Marcus could make out enough to determine that she had been young, perhaps the same age as the girl on the right, whose eyes troubled him so deeply. As he carefully worked on the section directly above where the 4th sister's face would have been, he noticed something that made him stop entirely, his hands trembling. There, faintly visible through the layers of paint, were eyes, Not the eyes of the removed sister, but eyes that seemed to belong to the overpainting itself, hidden within the decorative background elements that had been used to cover her figure. They were painted in a slightly different style, cruder than the original artist's refined technique, and they stared out from the canvas with an expression of such anguish and accusation that Marcus found himself unable to look away. "Good God!" he whispered into the empty room. This was no simple removal of an inconvenient relative. Someone had painted eyes into the background, deliberately placing them where the removed sister's face had been, creating a hidden accusation within the very act of concealment. It was as if the person who had performed the alteration or commissioned it wanted to leave a testament to what had been done, a secret message embedded in the canvas itself. Marcus stood and walked to the window, needing to break away from the portrait's unsettling gaze. Outside, Beacon Hill lay quiet under the gaslight. Respectable houses holding respectable families who told themselves respectable lies about their histories. How many of these fine homes held similar secrets? How many portraits hanging in drawing rooms had been altered, edited, corrected to present a more palatable version of the past? But this was different. The hidden eyes weren't just a record of erasure. They were a warning, or perhaps a confession. They spoke of guilt and fear, of a truth so terrible that it needed to be both hidden and preserved simultaneously. A soft sound made Marcus turn. Margaret Hawthorne stood in the doorway, a candle in her hand. She was dressed in a nightgown and robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the flickering light, she looked younger than her 25 years, almost childlike. "You've found them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Found what, Miss Hawthorne?" She entered the room, setting the candle on the table and approaching the portrait with visible reluctance. Her eyes went immediately to the section Marcus had been cleaning, to the faint outline of the removed figure and the hidden eyes above it. "The eyes that don't belong," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The eyes that watch. Catherine tried to warn you, but Eleanor wouldn't let her speak the full truth. Our father made us swear never to tell anyone about the fourth sister, about what happened to her. He said that some things were better left in the past, that there was no point in dredging up old tragedies." Marcus moved closer, lowering his voice to match hers. "What tragedy? Who was she?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very cold despite the room's warmth. "Her name was Abigail. She was our great-great-aunt, the youngest of the 4 sisters in the portrait. According to the family records our father kept hidden, she disappeared in the winter of 1788, a year after this portrait was painted. She was 15 years old. Disappeared how? That's what no one would ever say directly. The official story, the one that was carefully maintained for public consumption, was that she died of fever and was buried in the family plot. But there's no gravestone for her, Mr. Whitmore, no death record, no mourning notices in the newspapers of the time. She simply vanished from all documentation as if she had never existed." Marcus looked back at the portrait, at the faint outline of the girl who had been erased. "And the eyes?" Margaret followed his gaze, and he saw her shudder. "Those were added later, perhaps 10 or 20 years after Abigail's disappearance. Family legend says our great-grandfather commissioned them himself before he died, that he was tormented by guilt and wanted some record of what had been done, even if it could only be seen by someone who looked closely enough. He had the portrait moved to the attic shortly after, where it remained hidden for decades. What did he do to her?" Margaret turned away, unable or unwilling to look at the portrait any longer. "My father never told us directly. He would only say that our great-grandfather had made choices that were common for men of his time and position, choices involving the management of his household and the protection of his family's interests. He implied that Abigail had threatened those interests somehow, that she had learned something or planned to do something that would have destroyed the family's standing in society. The implications of her words settled over Marcus like a shroud. Men of wealth and position in colonial America had many ways of making problems disappear, especially when those problems involved young women who lacked the power to defend themselves. The Hawthorne fortune had been built on shipping, on trade with the Caribbean, on commodities that included human cargo. "You think your great-grandfather sold her?" Marcus said, the words tasting of ash in his mouth. Margaret's silence was answer enough. They stood together in the lamplight, contemplating the portrait that held its terrible secret. Marcus thought about the girl named Abigail, about her eyes in the original painting beneath the overpainting, about the life she might have lived if her family had chosen differently. He thought about the hidden eyes that had been deliberately painted into the background, a coded confession visible only to those who knew where to look. "Why did your father want this portrait restored?" Marcus finally asked. "Why bring this secret back to light after so many years?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. "He didn't. He never wanted anyone to touch this painting. It was Eleanor's decision, made after his death. She believes that the family has carried this shame long enough, that it's time for the truth to come out." Catherine agrees with her, though the thought of it terrifies her. "I'm less certain." "And what do you think should happen?" She met his eyes, and he saw in them the same terrible conflict he'd heard in her voice. "I think some truths are too heavy to carry, but too important to bury. I think Abigail deserves to be remembered, even if what happened to her damns our entire family. But I also think that revealing this secret won't bring her back. It won't undo what was done. It will only destroy what remains of the Hawthorne name and hurt people who had no part in her disappearance." Marcus understood the dilemma. In his years working with Boston's prominent families, he'd learned that every grand house held its share of darkness. The city's wealth had been built on enterprises that modern sensibilities found increasingly difficult to justify: the triangle trade, the exploitation of labor both enslaved and nominally free, the casual cruelty that men of power visited upon those without it. To pull back the veil on one family's sins would be to invite examination of everyone's hands. But Abigail had been real. She had sat for this portrait wearing silk and jewels, probably believing herself secure in her family's protection. And then she had been erased, painted over, removed from memory as if she had never existed at all. "I'm going to finish the restoration," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever I find, whatever the portrait reveals, I will document it faithfully. What your family chooses to do with that information is not my decision to make." Margaret nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "Then you should know one more thing before you continue. Our father kept a journal, a private account of family history that he worked on for years. In it, he wrote extensively about Abigail, about what he learned from his own father about her fate. Eleanor has it now. She's been reading it since his death, learning the full truth of what happened." "And what is the full truth?" "I don't know. Eleanor won't share it with us. She says we'll understand everything once the portrait is fully restored, that there's something in the painting itself that will make it all clear. She says that whoever painted those hidden eyes knew exactly what they were doing, that they left a message that can only be understood once all the layers are revealed." After Margaret left, Marcus stood alone with the portrait, studying the section he'd cleaned and the work that remained. The eyes hidden in the background stared at him with their terrible knowledge, and he felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He wasn't just restoring an old painting anymore. He was excavating a crime, bringing to light a truth that had been deliberately buried for more than 60 years. He worked late into the night, unable to stop himself despite his exhaustion. The portrait was calling to him now, demanding that he reveal its secrets. As each layer of grime and varnish fell away, more of the original painting emerged, and with it a growing sense of horror at what he was uncovering. The three visible sisters in the portrait weren't just posing for a formal painting. As their faces became clearer, Marcus could see the subtle variations in their expressions, the psychological complexity the original artist had captured. The eldest sister looked stern, but also haunted, as if she already knew what was coming. The middle sister's gentle smile now seemed forced, a mask hiding deeper distress. And the youngest visible sister, the one with the dead eyes, was looking directly at where the removed fourth sister would have been standing. She was looking at Abigail, and in her eyes was not love or sisterly affection, but something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had witnessed something terrible and had chosen to say nothing. Marcus didn't return to his own apartment that night. He fell asleep in a chair in the east parlor, his head resting on the table beside his cleaning supplies. When he woke, weak morning light was filtering through the windows, and Eleanor Hawthorne was standing before the portrait, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You've made remarkable progress," she said without turning to look at him. Marcus rose stiffly, his muscles protesting the uncomfortable sleeping position. "Miss Hawthorne, I didn't realize you were here." "I've been watching you work," she replied, still facing the portrait. "Not constantly, but checking in periodically. I wanted to see how much you'd reveal before I shared what I know." She finally turned to face him, and in the morning light he could see that she hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had a greyish pallor. "Margaret told me about your conversation last night. She said you intend to complete the restoration regardless of what it might reveal." "That's correct." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "Then I think it's time you read my father's journal. You should understand the full context of what you're uncovering before you go any further." She left the room briefly and returned carrying a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. She handed it to Marcus with an expression that suggested she was surrendering something precious and toxic simultaneously. "My father began writing this 15 years ago, after his own father died. He spent years researching the family history, tracking down old letters, interviewing elderly relatives who remembered stories passed down from previous generations. What he discovered about Abigail haunted him for the rest of his life." Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. "He never told us while he was alive. I found this journal in his study after his death, hidden in a locked drawer. I've been reading it every night since, trying to understand what kind of man my father was, what kind of family I come from." Marcus opened the journal. The handwriting was neat and precise, the script of a methodical mind. He turned to a section Eleanor had marked with a ribbon and began to read. The entries were dated 1834, written when Jonathan Hawthorne had been a young man recently returned from his first voyage to the West Indies. He had gone seeking information about Abigail from his grandfather, who was dying and finally willing to speak about the family's greatest shame. "Grandfather called me to his bedside today," the entry began. "His consumption has worsened considerably, and he knows his time is short. He told me that before he died, he needed to confess what happened to his youngest sister, Abigail. He said the secret had poisoned our family for decades, and he could not go to his grave without someone knowing the truth." Marcus continued reading, and with each sentence, the horror grew deeper. According to the journal, Abigail had been a spirited, intelligent girl who had shown an unfortunate tendency toward what her family considered inappropriate sympathies. In the autumn of 1788, she had discovered the true nature of her father's shipping business, that he transported human cargo from Africa to the Caribbean and the southern colonies. More than that, she had found records indicating that he also profited from the internal trade. moving enslaved people from northern ports to southern plantations as the moral climate in Massachusetts began to shift against the institution. Abigail had been appalled. According to the journal, she had confronted her father, declaring his business an abomination and threatening to expose him to the prominent abolitionists who were gaining influence in Boston society. This was 1788. A time when the debate over slavery was reaching a critical point in Massachusetts, when men like Jeremy Belknap were founding anti-slavery societies and pushing for abolition. Abigail's public accusations could have destroyed the family's standing and ended their fortune. Her father's response had been swift and terrible. He couldn't risk her speaking out, couldn't allow her moral clarity to threaten everything he had built, so he had made her disappear. The journal's next section made Marcus feel physically ill. Jonathan Hawthorne's grandfather had explained it with remarkable detachment, as if describing a necessary business transaction rather than the destruction of a 15-year-old girl's life and freedom. Grandfather told me that his father had Abigail taken in the night. The journal entry continued. She was drugged, bound, and placed aboard one of his own ships bound for Charleston. There she was sold, not openly, of course, but through the discreet channels that existed for such transactions. Her light complexion and educated speech would have made her valuable in certain households. Though grandfather suspected she was ultimately sent further south, perhaps to Louisiana or the Caribbean, where questions were less likely to be asked. Marcus had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the monstrousness of it. To sell your own daughter, your own flesh and blood, into slavery, to condemn her to a fate arguably worse than death, simply because she had possessed the moral courage to speak against injustice. But the journal continued with even darker revelations. After Abigail's disappearance, her father had commissioned the alteration to the portrait. He had hired a different artist, not the skilled master who had created the original, but a journeyman who would do what was asked without questions. This second artist had been instructed to paint over Abigail's figure, to erase her from the family record as completely as she had been erased from their lives. But the artist had been troubled by the commission. According to what Jonathan Hawthorne's grandfather had learned years later, the man had been racked with guilt over what he was helping to conceal. So he had left a message, a hidden testimony to the crime he was being paid to cover up. He had painted eyes into the background, positioning them where Abigail's face had been, making them visible only to careful examination. They were meant to be Abigail's own eyes, watching from beyond her erasure, bearing witness to what had been done to her. More than that, the artist had done something to the youngest visible sister's face, the girl who had been Abigail's contemporary, probably close to her in age. According to the journal, this sister, whose name had been Hannah, had been the one who betrayed Abigail to their father. She had read Abigail's private diary and discovered her plans to go public with her accusations. Rather than stand with her sister, Hannah had chosen family loyalty and self-preservation, carrying the information to their father and setting in motion the chain of events that led to Abigail's disappearance. The artist, knowing this, had altered Hannah's eyes in the original portrait. He had painted over them with the dead, lifeless gaze that Marcus had found so disturbing. The eyes of someone who had sacrificed her soul for security, who had chosen complicity over courage. Grandfather wept as he told me this, the journal entry concluded. He said that Hannah lived to be an old woman, but she never married, never left the family home. She spent her final years in increasing madness, claiming that she could see Abigail watching her from the walls, that her sister's eyes followed her everywhere she went. She died alone in 1842, screaming about eyes that wouldn't stop staring. Marcus closed the journal, his hands shaking. He understood now why Eleanor had wanted the portrait restored, why she was willing to risk the family's reputation to reveal this truth. This wasn't just about an old painting. It was about bringing Abigail back, about refusing to let her remain erased and forgotten. Eleanor had been watching him read. My father spent years trying to find out what happened to Abigail after she was sold. He hired investigators, traveled to the south, searched through old records. He never found her. The trail went completely cold after Charleston. She could have died on a plantation, been sold again to another owner, disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery that ground up so many lives. We'll never know. But we know what was done to her, Marcus said quietly. We know that her own family betrayed her, sold her, erased her from memory. That knowledge means something. Eleanor nodded, her composure cracking slightly. It means that the Hawthorne fortune, this house, our position in society, everything we have, was purchased with her freedom and probably her life. It means that every generation of our family has benefited from that original crime. And it means that those of us alive today have a choice to make. We can continue the erasure, keep the secret buried, maintain the comfortable lies that allow us to sleep at night. Or we can finish what you've started here and let the truth come to light. What will you do if the portrait reveals everything you suspect? Eleanor walked to the window, looking out at Beacon Hill with its respectable houses and respectable families. I'm going to donate it to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm going to tell them the full story, what was done to Abigail, how she was erased, why the portrait was altered. I'm going to make sure that when people in this city admire the fine houses and grand fortunes that were built in the years after the Revolution, they understand the human cost of that prosperity. That will destroy your family's reputation. Good, Eleanor said firmly, turning back to face him. We deserve to be destroyed. Not just the Hawthornes, but every family that participated in that evil. Our respectability is a lie built on the suffering of people we considered property. I won't pretend anymore. I won't let Abigail remain erased while I enjoy the benefits her destruction purchased. Marcus looked at the portrait, at the work that remained to be done. Then I should continue. Yes, Eleanor said. Finish it. Reveal everything. Over the next several days, Marcus worked with renewed purpose. He carefully removed every layer of yellowed varnish and grime, bringing the portrait back to its original brilliance. As the cleaning progressed, the hidden details became clearer, and the full extent of the artist's secret message emerged. The eyes painted into the background where Abigail's face had been were extraordinarily haunting. They were technically cruder than the original artist's work, painted with less refined skill, but with an emotional intensity that made them impossible to ignore once you knew they were there. They stared out from the canvas with an expression that combined accusation and sorrow, anger and pleading. They demanded recognition, refused to be ignored. More details emerged as Marcus worked on Hannah's portion of the portrait. The alteration to her eyes was subtle enough that most viewers would never consciously notice it. But once you understood what the artist had done, the effect was chilling. He had painted her eyes as windows into a dead soul, preserving for posterity the moment when she chose self-interest over justice, complicity over courage. The two older sisters in the portrait also revealed secrets under Marcus's careful cleaning. The stern eldest sister's expression now seemed less like natural authority and more like guilt masked by rigid control. The gentle middle sister's forced smile appeared to be hiding horror, a desperate attempt to maintain normalcy in the face of unbearable truth. The entire portrait was a testament to what had been done to Abigail, a coded confession embedded in canvas and paint. Every figure held part of the story, every detail spoke of conspiracy and guilt. The original artist had captured the family dynamics with psychological acuity, painting not just their faces, but their complicity. And the second artist, commissioned to erase Abigail, had instead ensured that she would never be forgotten by those who looked closely enough. As Marcus worked, the three Hawthorne sisters came regularly to check his progress. Catherine stood before the portrait for long periods, crying silently as Abigail's story emerged from beneath the years of concealment. Margaret watched with a combination of fascination and dread, understanding that with each layer Marcus removed, their family's comfortable mythology crumbled further. And Eleanor remained resolute, her jaw set with determination, ready to face whatever consequences came from this revelation. On the seventh day, Marcus completed the cleaning and stabilization of the canvas. The portrait now looked as it had the day the original artist finished it, minus the figure of Abigail herself. That section remained overpainted, a ghostly outline visible through the pentimento, the hidden eyes above it staring out with their terrible knowledge. "Should I attempt to restore Abigail?" Marcus asked Eleanor that evening as they stood before the completed portion of his work. The original paint layers are still there underneath, protected by the overpainting. With careful work, I could potentially remove the covering layers and reveal her original portrait. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, her eyes moving from the hidden eyes to the lifeless gaze of Hannah, to the guilty expressions of her other ancestors. "No," she finally said, "leave her as she is. The erasure is part of the story. Let people see what was done to her. Let them see the empty space where she should be. Let them see the hidden eyes that bear witness. That's the truth we need to tell. Not just that Abigail existed, but that she was deliberately removed, erased, painted over as if she never mattered." Marcus understood her reasoning, though part of him desperately wanted to bring Abigail fully back, to restore her to the portrait where she belonged. But Eleanor was right. The power of the painting now lay precisely in what had been done to it, in the visible evidence of erasure and the hidden testimony to a terrible crime. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. "The frame has a false back. My father noted it in his journal, but never had the courage to open it. I think it's time we did." Marcus examined the frame carefully and found what Eleanor had described. A thin panel that appeared to be part of the frame's backing, but was actually a separate piece, sealed with wax that had hardened over the decades. Working carefully, he loosened the seal and removed the panel. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still intact. Eleanor took it with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, difficult to read, but after a moment she began to speak the words aloud. "I, Thomas Garrett, being commissioned in October of 1789 to alter this family portrait by Mr. Henry Hawthorne, do set down this testament to what I have learned and what I have done. Mr. Hawthorne hired me to paint over his youngest daughter, to remove her from this portrait as he removed her from his family and from her freedom. He told me she had run away, but his servants whispered a different story, that she was taken by force, drugged and bound, placed upon a ship, bound for the slave markets of Charleston." Eleanor paused, her voice catching. Catherine and Margaret had entered the room and stood listening, holding each other's hands. Eleanor continued reading. "I am ashamed to have accepted this commission, but I am a poor man with a family to feed, and I could not refuse the payment he offered. Yet I could not let this crime go unmarked. So I have left testimony within the portrait itself. I have painted the eyes of the missing girl where her face once was, that she might forever watch those who betrayed her. And I have altered the eyes of the sister who informed against her, giving her the dead gaze she has earned through her treachery." The letter continued with more details about the commission, about Henry Hawthorne's cold instructions and Garrett's growing horror at what he was helping to conceal. It concluded with a statement that made Eleanor's hands shake as she read it. "I have hidden this letter in the frame, so that someday, when this portrait is examined by those who come after, They might know what was done to an innocent girl whose only crime was to speak the truth. Her name was Abigail Hawthorne. She was 15 years old. She believed in freedom and justice, and for that, her own father sold her into slavery. May God have mercy on his soul, for I cannot. Silence filled the room as the weight of Thomas Garrett's words settled over them. Marcus thought about the artist who had taken a commission to help conceal a crime and had instead created a lasting testament to it. He had risked his livelihood, possibly his life, to leave this hidden message. And now, more than 60 years later, his courage was finally being rewarded with revelation. The news spread through Boston society like fire through dry timber. Within days of Eleanor's formal presentation of the portrait and its accompanying documentation to the Massachusetts Historical Society, every drawing room in the city buzzed with discussion of the Hawthorne family's terrible secret. The newspapers picked up the story, publishing detailed accounts of Abigail's disappearance and the hidden messages in the portrait. Thomas Garrett's letter, carefully preserved and authenticated by historians, became a sensation. The portrait itself went on public display at the Historical Society, and crowds lined up to see it. People stared at the hidden eyes, at Hannah's altered gaze, at the empty space where Abigail should have been. They read the detailed placards Eleanor had insisted on, explaining every aspect of what had been done and why. The portrait became not just a piece of art, but a monument to a crime, a testament to the human cost of the fortunes that had built Boston's elite society. The reaction was predictably divided. Some praised Eleanor's courage in bringing this dark chapter to light, seeing it as a necessary reckoning with the city's complicity in slavery and the erasing of voices that spoke against it. Others condemned her for destroying her family's good name, for dredging up old scandals that served no purpose but to cause pain and embarrassment. But Eleanor didn't care about the condemnation. She had made her choice and accepted its consequences. The Hawthorne name would forever be associated with this terrible betrayal, but Abigail would no longer be erased. She would be remembered, and her story would be told. Marcus found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Newspapers interviewed him about the restoration process, about discovering the hidden eyes and Thomas Garrett's letter. Other prominent families nervously examined their own portrait collections, wondering what secrets might be hidden beneath layers of varnish and overpainting. Several commissioned him to perform similar restoration work, though whether they hoped to reveal or continue concealing their own family secrets, he couldn't say. A month after the portrait went on display, Marcus received a letter from Eleanor. She wrote that she and her sisters were selling the Beacon Hill mansion and most of their inherited wealth. They planned to donate the proceeds to organizations working to help formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Massachusetts and to document the histories of those who had been victimized by the slave trade. "We cannot undo what was done to Abigail," Eleanor wrote. "We cannot restore her freedom or give her back the life that was stolen, but we can refuse to continue benefiting from her suffering. We can use the fortune that was purchased with her life to fight against the institution that destroyed her. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's what we can do." The letter continued. "I think often about Thomas Garrett, about his courage in leaving that hidden testimony. He was a poor man who could have simply taken his payment and said nothing. Instead, he risked everything to ensure that Abigail would not be forgotten. His example reminds me that we all have choices to make about whether we will participate in evil or resist it, whether we will remain silent or speak truth even when it's dangerous." Marcus kept that letter, along with the extensive documentation he had compiled during the restoration. He thought about it often in the years that followed, as the portrait continued to draw viewers and spark conversations about freedom, justice, and the terrible things that people would do to protect their interests and their comfort. He thought about Abigail, wondering what had become of her after she was sold in Charleston. Had she survived the horrors of slavery? Had she ever escaped? Had she lived long enough to see the institution that had destroyed her family finally begin to crumble? He would never know, and that uncertainty haunted him. But he also thought about the message in the portrait, about the power of truth to survive even determined attempts to bury it. Abigail had been erased from family records, painted over in the portrait, removed from all official documentation. Yet she had not been forgotten. Thomas Garrett had ensured that her story remained, hidden but preserved, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. Years later, when the Civil War finally began to tear the nation apart over the question of slavery, Marcus would remember the portrait and Eleanor's words about freedom and truth. He would think about all the Abigails who had been erased, whose stories had been buried, whose voices had been silenced, and he would understand that the work of restoration wasn't just about cleaning old paintings. It was about revealing the hidden truths that people tried to conceal, about bearing witness to injustice, about refusing to let the comfortable lies stand unchallenged. The portrait of the Hawthorne Sisters remained on permanent display at the Massachusetts Historical Society, a testament to courage and cowardice, guilt and redemption. Visitors would stand before it and stare at the hidden eyes, at Hannah's dead gaze, at the empty space where Abigail should have been. They would read Thomas Garrett's letter and Eleanor's accompanying statement, and they would be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their own families, their own cities, their own complicity in systems of oppression. Some would turn away, uncomfortable with the portrait's accusatory stare. Others would linger, studying the details, trying to understand how such a thing could have happened, and a few would leave transformed, carrying with them a new understanding of the costs of silence, the importance of speaking truth, and the terrible things that happen when people choose comfort over justice. Marcus continued his restoration work, but he never forgot the Hawthorne portrait. Every time he uncovered a painting's hidden layers, he wondered what secrets might be revealed, what stories had been deliberately concealed. He had learned that every canvas held the potential for revelation, that beneath the visible surface lay truths that people had tried to bury but could never fully erase. In 1863, when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Marcus returned to the Historical Society to view the portrait once more. He stood before it for a long time, looking at the hidden eyes that had witnessed such injustice, thinking about Abigail and the countless others whose stories had been erased or forgotten. An elderly woman approached and stood beside him, her eyes also fixed on the portrait. She studied it in silence for several minutes before speaking. "My grandmother knew one of the Hawthorne sisters," she said quietly. "The eldest one, who had this portrait restored. She told me that Eleanor Hawthorne spent the rest of her life working to help people who had escaped slavery. She never married, never returned to society. She dedicated everything to trying to make amends for what her family had done." Marcus nodded, moved by this information. "Did she ever find out what happened to Abigail?" The woman shook her head. "No, the trail went cold in Charleston, as it did for so many. But Eleanor never stopped looking. She funded investigators, placed notices in newspapers throughout the South, interviewed people who might have known or heard something. Until the day she died, she was searching for her great-great-aunt, hoping against hope that Abigail might still be alive somewhere, that she might be found and brought home. They stood together in silence, two strangers united by the portrait's powerful testimony. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother said that Eleanor told her something shortly before she died. She said that every time she looked at this portrait, every time she saw those hidden eyes staring out from the canvas, she felt like Abigail was asking her a question. Will you remember me? Will you tell my story? Will you make sure that what happened to me means something?" The woman turned to Marcus, tears streaming down her weathered face. "That's why I come here. Why I bring my children and grandchildren to see this portrait. Because Abigail deserves to be remembered. Because her story matters. Because we have to bear witness to these terrible things so that we never let them happen again." Marcus understood. This was why Eleanor had made the choice she did, why she had been willing to destroy her family's reputation and sacrifice her own comfort. It was why Thomas Garrett had risked everything to leave his hidden testimony. It was why Marcus himself had continued the restoration, even when he understood the terrible secrets it would reveal. Some truths are too important to remain buried. Some voices demand to be heard, even across decades of silence. Some eyes keep watching, waiting for someone to finally see them and acknowledge what they witnessed. The portrait of the Hawthorne sisters would remain on display for generations, its hidden eyes continuing to stare out at viewers, its empty space continuing to testify to the girl who had been erased. And Abigail's story would be told and retold, ensuring that she would never again be forgotten, never again be painted over, never again disappear into the comfortable lies that people tell themselves about their history. In the end, that was the true restoration, not just the cleaning of an old painting, but the recovery of a voice that had been silenced, the revelation of a truth that had been concealed, the insistence that every life matters and every story deserves to be told, even when those stories make us uncomfortable, even when they force us to confront the terrible things that people have done to each other in the name of profit and respectability. The eyes in the portrait would keep watching, and as long as they did, Abigail would not be forgotten. Her story would continue to challenge viewers to examine their own choices, to ask themselves what they would do when faced with injustice, to consider whether they would choose courage or complicity, truth or comfortable lies. And in that ongoing challenge, in that refusal to let the past remain buried, lay the portrait's true power and its lasting message about the essential importance of freedom. Not just freedom from chains, but freedom to speak truth, freedom to be remembered, freedom to exist as a full human being whose life and death matter. Marcus left the Historical Society that day with a renewed sense of purpose. He had helped restore more than just a painting. He had helped restore a voice, a presence, a testimony to injustice that would not be silenced. And in doing so, he had played a small part in the larger restoration of truth that the nation was undergoing as it finally began to reckon with the terrible institution that had divided it and the countless lives that had been destroyed in its maintenance. The portrait remained, with its hidden eyes and its empty space, with its testimony to betrayal and its challenge to all who viewed it. Abigail Hawthorne, erased from family records and painted over in the portrait, had nevertheless refused to disappear. Her eyes kept watching, her story kept being told, and her question kept being asked, "Will you remember me? Will you make sure that what happened to me means something?" The answer, Marcus hoped, would always be yes.